The Pike sisters' breeding barn. 37 men were found chained up in that barn after being missing for years. That's what the state police found in 1901, deep in the West Virginia mountains. But the real nightmare wasn't finding out. It was how long everyone knew. Along the old Pike Road, men have been disappearing for 20 years. They were young travelers or drifters looking for work. They walked toward the Pike farm and just vanished. People in town talked about the two sisters, Elizabeth and Martha Pike, who lived alone up there. They said they were strange and could charm men. Sheriff Brody said the mountains were to blame and called them accidents. But when the journalist from Charleston started asking questions, he found something much worse than murder. A barn full of broken men who had been used, bred, and kept like animals. Some of them were so broken that they couldn't remember their own names. The reporter thought he was looking for a story, but instead he became the 38th victim. How can a whole town stay quiet when dozens of men are suffering just a few miles away? The coal dust never really settled in Black Creek. It stuck to everything like a fine gray shroud that made the mountain town feel like it was always stuck between seasons. As Thomas Abernathy stepped off the train in the morning, he could feel it coating his throat. His leather satchel was full of newspaper clippings and pictures of men who had just disappeared. He was 26 years old and already had too many unanswered questions on his mind. He had traveled from Charleston to follow rumors of a story that most reasonable people would have dismissed as mountain folklore. But Thomas had known for a long time that the most disturbing truths were often hidden behind the simplest explanations. There were reports of missing people going back 20 years, and they were spread out over several counties like breadcrumbs that didn't lead anywhere. Drifters, mostly men looking for work in the coal mines or traveling through the remote hollows of West Virginia. Young men with calloused hands and empty pockets who had walked into the mountains and never come back. The official records were thin and full of the casual indifference of small-town police who were more interested in keeping the peace than finding out what really happened. But Thomas had seen something that everyone else had missed or chosen to ignore. Every single person who had gone missing had done so within 10 miles of the old Pike Road, a winding dirt road that went through the most remote parts of the county and ended at a single, weathered farmhouse. Sheriff Brody sat behind his desk like he had grown roots there. His huge body spilled over the edges of a chair that had clearly seen better decades. His eyes showed the tired acceptance of someone who had spent too many years trying to explain things that couldn't be explained. He didn't look up from the stack of papers he was pretending to read when he said, "You're wasting your time, son. These mountains eat people. They've always done that. Mine shafts fall apart, rivers flood, and men get lost in the woods and die of the cold in the winter. It's not a mystery. It's just nature taking what it wants." But Thomas had read the reports and seen the pattern that Brody either couldn't see or didn't want to see. He asked, "What about the Pike sisters?" and saw the sheriff's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Several witness statements mentioned their property men seen going that way before they disappeared. Brody's laugh was harsh and bitter. The Pike women keep to themselves. They always have. Elizabeth and Martha have lived up there since their daddy died 15 years ago. People in town leave them alone, and they leave us alone. That's how it works around here. He finally looked up, his eyes hard as creek stones. You should keep that in mind, Mr. Abernathy. We don't like it when people from outside come in and cause trouble where there isn't any. It seemed like the town itself was echoing Brody's warning. When Thomas walked into the general store, the post office, or the little diner that served coffee strong enough to strip paint, everyone stopped talking. People watched him with the wary intensity of people guarding something valuable and delicate. When he asked about the missing men, the Pike Road, or anything else that might help him with his investigation, people were quiet in a way that seemed planned and practiced. The few people who did talk only said vague things about how dangerous it is to live in the mountains and how drifters tend to keep drifting. The first person to talk about the whispers was Mrs. Caldwell, the old woman who ran the boarding house where Thomas stayed. She brought him coffee on the second night, and her hands shook a little as she put the cup down. "You're asking about things that should stay buried," she said right away. "The Pike women? They ain't natural. Never have been. Their daddy was strange enough, God rest his soul. But those girls? There's something wrong with them. Wrong in the soul." Thomas leaned forward, feeling the crack in the town's wall of silence. "What do you mean?" "Mrs." Caldwell looked toward the window, as if she thought someone was listening in the darkening light. "They charm men," she said in a low voice. "That's what people say. Men go up that mountain to their place and don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all. It's been that way since they were young women, maybe 20 years now. Travelers mostly. Men passing through who nobody would miss right away." It was hard to understand what the old woman said, but it was also hard to ignore. Thomas wanted to know more. But Mrs. Caldwell had already gone behind the same wall of silence that kept the rest of the town safe. "You should finish what you have to do here and then leave," she said, shaking hands as she picked up his empty plate. "Some stones are better not to turn." But Thomas had made a name for himself by turning over rocks and going into the dark places where others were afraid to go. The next morning, the sky was gray, and it looked like it might rain. This was the perfect weather for what he had planned, he told Mrs. Caldwell, that he was going to write a story about life in the remote hollows of West Virginia, a human interest piece about the families who made a living in places that the rest of the world had forgotten. It wasn't a complete lie, but he thought the truth he might find was much worse than anything that would ever be published in a respectable newspaper. The Pike Road was only wide enough for a wagon and went through thick woods that seemed to swallow sound and light. Thomas walked for the better part of an hour before the trees finally gave way to a clearing where the Pike farmhouse squatted like a wounded animal. The house itself wasn't very interesting. It was just a simple wooden structure that had been through too many harsh winters and not enough care. But the barn made Thomas's skin crawl, a short building that looked strangely fortified for being so far away. The walls were made stronger by heavy timber beams, and the windows had been boarded up from the inside with planks that looked like they had just been put up. The doors were locked with thick iron locks, more than any barn should need. A sound from inside the barn made Thomas's blood run cold as he stood at the edge of the clearing. It was a low, rhythmic hum that was strangely sad, as if someone inside was singing a lullaby to calm themselves down from the worst despair. The sound came and went in a way that was almost hypnotic, and sometimes other voices joined in to create a harmony that showed they were used to whatever ritual was going on behind those boarded windows. Thomas felt a deep fear wash over him, the kind of fear that goes beyond reason and logic. Every instinct told him to turn around and walk back down the mountain road, to forget what he had heard and act like the whispers in Black Creek were just small-town superstition. But the journalist in him, the part that had brought him to this lonely place, told him to stay and find out what was really going on with the humming, the locks, and the 20 years of men who had gone into these mountains and never come out. The door to the farmhouse opened before Thomas could knock, as if someone had been watching him since he entered the clearing. The woman in the doorway was tall and thin, and her harsh face showed the effects of years of hard work in the mountains and something else. Something that had turned into a permanent distrust of the world outside her property. Elizabeth Pike looked at him with eyes that showed no warmth or interest in why a stranger had come up her mountain road on a gray October morning. She just waited, her strong hands gripping the door frame as if she were ready to slam it shut at the first sign of trouble. "Miss Pike," Thomas said, taking off his hat in a polite way. "I'm Thomas Abernathy from the Charleston Gazette. I was hoping to talk to you about life in these mountains, maybe for a story about the families who live in these remote areas." The lie came easily, wrapped in the kind of polite respect that usually opened doors in rural areas. But Elizabeth's face didn't change. "We don't talk to newspaper people," she said, her voice flat and final, like someone who is used to getting the last word. Got nothing to say that would interest city folk. A soft, musical laugh came from somewhere behind her and made Thomas's hair stand on end. Another woman came to the door. She was shorter than the first woman, but she had the same sharp features. Elizabeth's face was hard as granite, but Martha Pike's face was full of childlike wonder, which didn't fit with her 40 years of life. Her smile was too big and empty, like a mask that had been painted on and never taken off. "Now, sister," Martha said in a voice that sounded like she was talking to a child, "maybe the gentleman just wants to hear about How we serve the Lord in our simple way. Wouldn't it be nice to tell someone how we live according to His Word? She turned that unsettling smile toward Thomas, and he felt something cold crawl up his spine. Mr. Vend. Abernathy, we're God-fearing women. We've been taking care of this land and doing His work for 15 years, ever since our father went to heaven. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but she moved out of the way so Thomas could get onto the covered porch. The inside of the farmhouse was simple but clean, with handmade furniture that showed how alone and self-sufficient the people who lived there were. There were religious texts on every surface, and dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters. The smell was too much for Thomas to handle. It was sage and lavender, and something else he couldn't place, something that smelled like medicine and was a little sweet. The sisters talked about their simple lives for almost an hour, as if they had told the same story many times before. They took care of their garden and had a few chickens, Elizabeth said. They read the Bible and prayed for the souls of those who were less fortunate. Martha nodded, along with everything her sister said, sometimes adding comments about how beautiful God's creation was and how peaceful they felt alone. Thomas understood that it was a show, just like any other stage show. Every word had been practiced, and every gesture was meant to show that the two women were alone but had found comfort in faith and hard work. Thomas almost believed it. The stories he heard in town started to sound like mean gossip from people who didn't like anyone who was different or who chose to live outside of what their community expected of them. The Pike sisters were strange, that's for sure, but a lot of people who lived in the mountains were strange by city standards. Maybe the missing men really did die in the harsh wilderness, and the sisters were just easy targets for a town that didn't want to believe that people sometimes disappeared for no better reason than bad luck and bad decisions. He was getting ready to leave when he saw it. The wooden bird was on a small table by the door, and it looked so well carved that it seemed ready to fly. Thomas had seen dozens of missing person posters in his research, had studied every photograph and description until the faces blurred together in his mind. But this one detail had stuck with him because it was so specific. Jacob Morrison, 24, was a traveling wood carver who had gone missing 5 years ago while passing through the county. The poster had mentioned that Morrison was known for carving small birds, each one unique, each one bearing his distinctive style of intricate featherwork that made them seem almost alive. The bird on the Pike sisters' table looked just like the one in Morrison's picture, right down to the tiny notches that showed where each feather was and the way the head was tilted as if it were listening for a sound far away. Thomas felt his carefully thought-out excuse fall apart like a house of cards. This wasn't a coincidence, a figment of his imagination, or small-town bias. It was proof that was right in front of him like a trophy. He was able to keep his cool long enough to thank the sisters for their time and promise to show their simple lives the respect they deserved. As he walked back down the mountain road, though, his hands were shaking, and the humming from the barn seemed to follow him even after the farmhouse was out of sight behind the trees. That night, Thomas broke into the courthouse in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew him as a good journalist. The lock on the back door was old and not well taken care of. It gave way to his pocket knife and a few minutes of careful work. As he walked to the records room, the building creaked around him. He was guided by the thin beam of his electric torch and a sense of urgency that was almost desperation. The property records told a story of careful buying that no one who might have cared about it had noticed. The Pike sisters had quietly bought up all the land around their original farm over the past 20 years, using money that didn't seem to come from anywhere. They bought 12 separate parcels of land, each with cash, and each time they did, their property line moved farther into the wilderness and away from nosy neighbors. They had built a kingdom of isolation, a place where anything that happened stayed hidden behind walls of trees and planned secrecy. The missing person files painted an even darker picture. Thomas put the reports on a dusty table and watched in horror as the pattern became clear. The last place anyone saw the missing men was near the Pike Road or asking for directions to the Pike farm. Some people were looking for work, while others were just passing through. They were all young. Everyone was on their own. All had vanished without a trace. Thomas found the complaint buried deep in a box of old cases that had been sitting around for 10 years. It was almost dawn. The handwriting was shaky, but readable. It was from a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Marsh, who had accused the Pike sisters of seducing men in an ungodly way and holding one against his will, which is against Christian decency and the law. Marsh said he saw men working on the Pike farm who moved like they were sleepwalking and were too scared to look him in the eye or speak above a whisper. He asked for an investigation and said he would call the state police if the local police didn't do anything. Sheriff Brody's predecessor had thrown out the complaint, saying it was the rantings of a drunk person. He also wrote in the margin that Marsh had been found drunk outside the local saloon 3 times. There was no investigation. There were no questions. The complaint had been put away and forgotten about. This is another inconvenient truth that has been buried under the weight of willful ignorance. Thomas sat in the pale morning light streaming through the courthouse windows, the complaint trembling in his hands as he finally understood the full scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a story about missing men or strange women in the mountains. It was about a community that had chosen comfort over conscience and convenience over justice for decades. The truth was here all along, just waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find it. The weight of 20 years of buried truth pressed down on Thomas like a physical thing as he made his way back up the Pike Road 3 nights later, his pockets heavy with the tools of breaking and entering he had never imagined he would need. The pry bar felt strange in his hands. It was cold steel that made him think of violence and desperation instead of the careful work of journalism that he had always been proud of. But the wooden bird kept coming back to him in his dreams, and the faces of 37 missing men needed more than polite questions and careful answers. They wanted him to do something, even if it meant going places he had never thought to go. The farmhouse was dark against the October sky, and none of the windows that faced the road had any light in them. Thomas had watched the property for 2 nights, noting the sisters' habits with the patience of a man who understood that haste would mean discovery, and discovery would mean joining the ranks of those who had walked into these mountains and never walked out. The sisters went to bed early and got up with the sun. Their movements were as regular as the phases of the moon. The barn was the only place where sounds could be heard by midnight. There was a low humming that never seemed to stop, and every now and then there were other noises that Thomas didn't want to look too closely at. The barn door gave way with a groan of protesting wood that seemed to echo throughout the valley. Thomas held his breath and waited for lights to come on in the farmhouse windows. He knew the sisters would come running with shotguns and righteous anger. But the house stayed dark, and after what felt like hours, Thomas slipped into the barn and shut the door behind him. First, he smelled it. A mix of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else. Something that made his stomach turn that smelled like medicine. His lantern cast dancing shadows across the interior as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, and what he saw there would stay with him for the rest of his life. Like animals, they were tied to the walls and support beams. Almost 30 men who are in different stages of physical and mental decline. Some were so thin that their ribs showed through skin that had turned pale from years of not getting any sun. Others rocked back and forth in time with the humming, their eyes blank and staring at nothing. Thomas walked through them like a man walking through his own nightmare. His lantern lit up faces that ranged in age from teenagers to men in their 42nds. Some watched him with the desperate hope of those who still remembered what freedom felt like, while others seemed not to notice his presence at all. The chains were new, heavy iron links that had been bolted into the barn's foundation. This showed that they had been planned and prepared for years. There were water buckets and crude chamber pots all over the place, and in one corner there were piles of simple clothes and blankets that smelled like neglect and despair. Thomas found Samuel, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, in the back of the barn. His hair was messy, but his eyes still showed a hint of the intelligence that had once made him who he was. Samuel, on the other hand, looked straight at Thomas right away, his eyes sharp with recognition and desperate hope. "You're not one of them," he whispered. His voice was hoarse from not being used, but it had an urgency that cut through the barn's heavy air. "Please, you have to help us leave." Thomas knelt next to him and looked at the heavy chain that held Samuel's ankle to an iron ring in the wall of the barn. He asked, "How long have you been here?" But part of him was afraid of the answer. Samuel said, 3 months, maybe 4, in quick, scared bursts. as if he was afraid someone would hear him. I was heading west, looking for work in the Colorado mines. They offered me a meal and a place to sleep. Said I could work their farm for a few days to earn some traveling money. The tea tasted strange, bitter, and when I woke up, I was here. He pointed to the other prisoners with a gesture that showed he was used to being careful. Some of these men have been here for years. The older ones don't even remember their names anymore. The sisters use us for work during the day, making us work their fields and take care of their animals. But at night, Samuel's voice trailed off, and Thomas saw him shudder even though the barn was so hot. What happens at night? They come for us, Samuel said in a low voice. Not all of us, never all at once. They choose one or two, sometimes more if they're feeling particularly inspired. They have rituals, ceremonies they call them. They believe they're building something pure, something holy, a new bloodline. They say with them as the mothers of a chosen people, they drug us with herbs that make us compliant, make us forget ourselves. And afterward, they chain us back up like we're nothing more than breeding stock. Samuel's casual way of talking about horrible things that were hard to understand hit Thomas like a physical blow. These weren't just men who were missing. They were slaves who had been living in a nightmare for decades while the whole community ignored it. Thomas said, "The town knows." More to himself than to Samuel. They have to know. Samuel laughed, but it was a bitter laugh that didn't have any humor in it. The town knows exactly what it wants to know. Sheriff Brody comes by sometimes, always in the daytime when we're working the fields. The sisters tell him we're hired hands, men who work for room and board. He sees our chains and calls them leg irons to keep us from running off with their property. He says it's a good way to deal with drifters and troublemakers. Thomas started using the pry bar on Samuel's chain, looking for any weak spots in the iron links or the mounting that might give way under pressure or desperation. The metal was in good shape and well secured, but Thomas had seen a loose floorboard near Samuel's position that might give him the angle he needed. "I'm going to get you out of here," he promised. But he didn't know how he could free a dozen men without making a noise that would bring the sisters running. "Just me won't be enough," Samuel said, understanding immediately what Thomas was thinking. "Someone will know you were here if you take one of us. They'll move the others and probably kill them instead of risking exposure. You need to get help. Bring the state police or federal marshals, someone with power that Brody can't ignore or scare." But as Thomas worked at the chain, his mind raced with ideas and plans. The barn door creaked open behind them, and it sounded like hope itself was coming to an end. Elizabeth Pike stood in the doorway, her strong body casting a shadow against the moonlight. She looked like an avenging angel with a terrible purpose. She held an axe handle in her hands. It was smooth from years of use and dark from things Thomas didn't want to talk about. "Well now," she said, her voice calm and satisfied, which was somehow scarier than any scream of anger. "Looks like we found another person to help with the Lord's work." Thomas stood up, holding the pry bar in hands that suddenly felt clumsy and not enough. He had thought about this moment while he was awake at night, planning it out. He had practiced what he would say if he was caught, how he would explain why he was there, and maybe even how he would convince the sisters to let their prisoners go. But when he saw Elizabeth's cold smile and how casually she held her weapon, all of his carefully thought-out words disappeared like morning fog. He started by saying, "You don't understand." But Elizabeth was already on the move, crossing the barn floor with the smooth grace of someone who had done this many times before. She easily dodged Thomas's awkward swing of the pry bar and stepped inside his reach, bringing the axe handle down on his head with a sound like splitting kindling. He fell to the floor of the barn, and pain shot through his head. His vision blurred, and his ears rang with the sound of the impact. As the darkness grew, he heard Samuel calling his name, and the other prisoners moving around in a way that showed they were hopeless and had had their dreams crushed over and over again. When Thomas woke up, he was chained to the wall next to Samuel. His head hurt, and his mouth tasted like blood and bitter herbs. The barn looked different from this perspective, more cramped and desperate, filled with the weight of accumulated despair that pressed down like a physical presence. Elizabeth stood in front of him and looked at his face with the same detached interest as someone looking at a new cow. "Mr. Abernathy, welcome to the family," she said. Thomas slowly realized with horror that he was no longer the one telling this story. He was now a part of it, another victim in a nightmare that didn't seem to have an end. In the suffocating darkness of the Pike barn, time lost all meaning. Days didn't matter. What mattered was the rhythm of pain that ruled their lives. Thomas learned that the sisters had a schedule that was as strict as any factory's. They got up before dawn to do their real farm work, and their captives stayed chained in the dark until the sun came up, when they could pretend to be hired help. The trick was so well planned and so well executed that Thomas began to see how an entire community could choose to ignore terrible things happening just out of sight. Thomas saw the true extent of the Pike sisters' methods during his third week of captivity. Martha came to the barn with a wooden tray full of clay cups that looked like regular tea. She moved from prisoner to prisoner with the gentle care of a nursemaid, never losing her childlike smile. But Thomas had learned to look into her eyes and see the calculating intelligence that was hidden behind her blank face. Her voice sounded like someone reading a favorite scripture when she knelt next to an older man named Benjamin, who had been there so long that he only answered to the name 12. "Drink up, my dear ones," she said softly, stroking Benjamin's messy hair like a mother would. "This will help you remember your purpose and understand the beautiful work we're doing together. The Lord has chosen you all for something special, something pure and holy that the outside world wouldn't understand." Benjamin drank without resistance, his eyes already glazed with the resignation of someone whose spirit had been broken so thoroughly that compliance had become his only refuge from further pain. Thomas turned down the tea, and Elizabeth hit him with the handle of her axe, which made his vision swim with stars. Even though he was in pain, he watched as Martha changed as her sister took over the enforcement duties. The mask of a child fell off like old clothes, showing a mind that was both brilliant and completely insane. Martha's voice lost all pretense of innocence when she said, "You still think you're better than us? Do you still think you know what's right and wrong, good and evil? You'll learn, just like everyone else did. We're making paradise here, one perfect child at a time, and you're going to help us, whether you like it or not." The news hit Thomas like a punch in the gut. Martha wasn't Elizabeth's simple-minded partner in crime, and she wasn't the poor victim of her sister's control that he thought she was. She was the architect of their entire philosophy, the sick mind that turned personal trauma into a sick theology of female superiority and male subjugation. Elizabeth carried out the crimes, but Martha gave them the religious justification they needed to see them as God's will. Samuel had told him about the worst parts and gotten him ready as much as anyone could be for the rituals that happened after dark, when the barn became a temple to Martha's twisted idea of spiritual purity. Thomas learned to see the signs, how the sisters would choose their victims based on some strange system of rotation and preference, how Martha would make her special dishes with herbs that kept men awake but compliant, turning them into shambling puppets who could barely remember their own names by morning. Some of the older prisoners showed signs of having been chemically controlled for years. Their minds were so broken from being dosed over and over that they were always in a state of childlike dependence. Thomas started to realize that some of the men had completely lost their minds during the 4th week of his captivity. 7 was a prisoner who had forgotten his real name so completely that he only answered to that name. He did his assigned tasks with the mechanical precision of a clockwork toy. When Thomas tried to talk to 7 about his life before the barn, 7 looked at him with real confusion, as if the idea of being anywhere else was too hard to understand. 7 said with complete certainty, as if she had been brainwashed, "This is where I belong. The sisters look after us and give us a reason to live. Why would I want to leave?" The worst part of their captivity wasn't the chains, the forced labor, or even the nighttime violations that Martha called sacred communion. It was the planned destruction of identity, taking apart everything that made a man who he was, leaving only the parts that were useful to the sisters. Thomas saw it happen to newer prisoners. He saw them fight against the drugs, the isolation, and the constant reminders of how worthless they were until it became too painful to keep fighting. Samuel stayed strong, and his will was unbroken even after 4 months in prison. But Thomas could see that his resolve was starting to crack and that he was feeling hopeless for longer periods of time every day. Samuel taught Thomas the little things they could do to rebel, that kept them human, even when they were being deliberately dehumanized. When the sisters weren't looking, they shared bits of food, whispered the names of loved ones to keep memories alive, and reminded the other prisoners of things from their past lives that Martha's drugs tried to erase. He would whisper, "My name is Samuel Morrison," in the darkest hours before dawn. "I come from Pennsylvania. I have a sister named Rebecca who's probably married by now. I was going to Colorado to work in the silver mines and send money home to help with her wedding." The sisters couldn't poison or chain the prayer-like repetition that became a declaration of selfhood. Thomas joined this quiet resistance and told stories about his life in Charleston, his job at the newspaper, and the editor named Harris who had sent him on this assignment and was probably wondering why he never got the articles he promised. Thomas's patient questions and Samuel's gentle encouragement made the other prisoners start to remember parts of their own pasts. They found out that 12 used to be Benjamin Ashworth, a clockmaker from Maryland. 7 was William Crane, a teacher who the sisters took in 8 years ago when he was on his way to a new job in Ohio. But even as they fought to keep their identities, the outside world kept letting them down with a lack of care that was almost as bad as the sisters' cruelty. Thomas's heart raced with desperate hope when he heard familiar voices outside the barn on a gray November morning. He recognized the gruff voice of Sheriff Brody talking about the missing journalist from Charleston. Thomas could see Brody's big body through the gaps in the barn's boarded windows as he questioned Elizabeth with the kind of thoroughness that comes from someone who is going through the motions and doesn't expect to find anything wrong. "That reporter guy came by and asked dumb questions," Elizabeth said with the practiced anger of someone who has been wronged. "He was drunk as a lord and talking nonsense about missing people and other things. We told him to leave because we were God-fearing women who didn't need his kind of trouble. The last time we saw him, he was stumbling back toward town. He probably went to find another bottle somewhere." Thomas yelled until his voice gave out, threw himself against his chains until his wrists bled, and did everything he could to get Brody's attention. But the barn was well built and soundproofed, and Brody didn't seem interested in looking into it any more than he needed to. "Well, his editor has been asking questions," Brody said, but the way he said it made it sound like he thought the matter was over. "I'll tell him the guy left, probably to chase another story. These newspaper people aren't very trustworthy." When Brody's horse went back down the Pike Road, Thomas felt something die inside him that he didn't know was still alive. The realization hit him like a shroud over a grave. There would be no help, no time when justice would come to make things right. The community had chosen to ignore the truth. The law had chosen to ignore the problem, and the Pike sisters would keep doing their work until they were too old or something bad happened to them. Thomas understood then why so many of the prisoners had given up. Resistance seemed like a cruel joke on men who had already lost everything that mattered. Hope itself became a form of torture in the face of such systematic indifference. It was another way for the sisters to break what was left of their spirits. The change didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual awakening that spread through Thomas, like warmth returning to frostbitten limbs. Thomas realized that his search for a story had become something much more important and dangerous during his 6th week in captivity. He saw Samuel quietly encouraging a broken man named Peter to remember his daughter's face. It was no longer about getting recognition in the press or making headlines. This was about the basic human duty to speak out against systematic evil, even if it meant risking his life. During the long nights of November, when the wind howled through cracks in the barn walls, the plan began to take shape. The sisters' rituals became more important as winter approached, and they needed to finish their sacred work before the mountain passes became impassable. Samuel had been looking at the loose floorboard near his chains for weeks, working on it with the patience of a man who knew that if he rushed, he would be caught, and if he was caught, he would die. Years of moisture and neglect had made the board weak, and Samuel had figured out that if he pushed down at just the right angle, he could get enough leverage to break the iron ring that held his ankle chain to the barn floor. Thomas became the lookout and got an almost supernatural sense of the sisters' habits and movements. He could tell Martha's footsteps on the porch of the farmhouse apart from his sister's lighter, more erratic steps. He could tell exactly when they would be in the kitchen making dinner, when they would go to their separate rooms to pray, and when they would come out to choose their victims for the night. In a situation where he couldn't use his physical strength or run away like everyone else, this knowledge became his weapon. The storm came on a December night when the temperature had dropped below freezing. The wind brought the promise of snow that would keep them all trapped until spring. Thomas felt the change in air pressure like a weight on his chest. He knew that the storm was coming and that it was the chance they had been waiting for. The sound of chains breaking would be drowned out by thunder. Lightning would light up the area for a short time without the sisters having to carry a lantern, and they would be too busy protecting their property from the storm's fury to pay attention to anything else. As the first big raindrops hit the roof of the barn, Samuel worked on his chain with all his might. The loose floorboard creaked and groaned under the weight until the iron ring finally broke free from its moorings with a sound like snapping bone. Samuel's ankle was still chained, but he could move around the barn freely, with his chain dragging behind him like the ghost of his former captivity. "Fire," he said to Thomas, in a voice that was hard to hear over the storm getting worse. "I'll set a fire in the hay to draw them out. When they come running, you get to the farmhouse. There's an old hunting rifle above the mantel, and Martha keeps the keys to all our chains in a wooden box beside her bed." The plan was desperate and flawed, and it depended on timing and luck, as well as the hope that men who had been broken by years of captivity might find the strength to fight when the time came. But when Thomas looked around the barn at the faces of the other prisoners, he saw something he didn't expect. A flash of the old determination that Martha's drugs and violence had tried so hard to kill. They knew this might be their only chance, and they knew that failing would mean not just death, but more horrors that had already taken too many lives. Samuel moved with the smooth grace of someone who had practiced every step in their head 1,000 times. He gathered up old hay and straw and piled them against the barn's wooden walls in places that would make the most smoke and confusion. The first flames lit up as a loud clap of thunder shook the building to its core. Orange light danced across the faces of men who had been living in darkness for years. The fire spread quickly, using the old wood and dry timber that made up the prison's walls to fuel itself. As if a giant's boot had kicked it open, the barn door flew open. Elizabeth ran through the smoke with her axe handle raised and murder in her eyes. She had thought that her prisoners would be cowering in their chains, not a well-planned rebellion led by men who had found their ability to be angry for a good reason again. Samuel met her with a broken chain, and Thomas fought his way through the smoke toward the barn door and the farmhouse beyond, free from the chaos and confusion. When he walked into the Pike sisters' kitchen, it was like looking into the mind of the person who had planned 20 years of systematic horror. Martha's wooden box held more than just keys. It held detailed records written in her careful handwriting that listed every man they had taken, every ritual they had performed, every child born from their unholy unions, and what had happened to those children. The rifle on the mantel was loaded and ready, as if Martha had always known that their work might face violent opposition one day. When Thomas got back to the barn, he saw something that looked like something out of Dante's worst nightmare. The fire had spread to cover almost half of the building, casting everything in a hellish orange light that made the violence seem even more unreal. Martha lay crumpled against the wall, her neck bent at an odd angle from where she had fallen during the first chaos. Her face was full of grief and anger. Elizabeth grabbed Samuel by the throat with one hand and a knife with the other. "You've killed her," she screamed, her voice breaking with the first real emotion Thomas had ever heard from her. "You've killed the most holy woman who ever lived, and now you'll all burn for it." But the other prisoners had found their own weapons. Chains, farming tools, and broken pieces of wood that men who had been abused for years turned into clubs when they finally saw a chance for justice. They moved as one, fueled by a rage that was both beautiful and horrible to see. As Elizabeth disappeared under a wave of bodies that had been turned into nothing and now wanted everything back, her knife fell to the floor. The weeks that followed were a blur of testimony and investigation, with state police officers asking questions that should have been asked years ago and reporters coming from as far away as New York to cover the Pike sisters' crimes. Thomas's article, "The Silent Harvest of Black Creek," made front-page news in papers all over the country. It caused outrage and calls for change that went all the way to the governor's office. Sheriff Brody was fired in shame. He was charged with criminal negligence and obstruction of justice, which would have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. The men who survived slowly reunited with families who had mourned them for years, but many would never fully heal from the mental scars left by their time in prison. Samuel went back to Pennsylvania, where his sister Rebecca had married but had never stopped hoping to hear from her missing brother. Some of the older prisoners needed permanent care because their minds were too broken from years of drug and mental abuse to be able to take care of themselves. Thomas himself became a reluctant hero, and his co-workers and readers praised him for his investigation, which they saw as a victory for journalistic integrity over small-town corruption. But the praise felt empty when he thought about how much it cost him to tell the story and how 37 men had suffered for years while he went about his business in comfortable ignorance. He kept the picture from the crime scene on his desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how much truth cost everyone it touched. The picture showed the Pike sisters' barn after the fire, with its burned beams reaching up to a gray sky like the ribs of a huge animal. The chains that had held so many men for so long lay in the wreckage, barely visible through the smoke. They were finally broken, but they would always mark the spot where evil thrived in the silence of people who chose not to see.